So a horizontal asymptote is always going to be y equals. Those are horizontal lines. One way I remember it is that the y is an upside down h. Haha. So as I go to the right, the y value is getting closer and closer to some value b. As I go to the left, y is going to also get closer and closer to the same y value b, where b is a finite real number. It's a definite number. Vertical asymptotes are vertical lines. They're always x equals some number. As I approach that number from the right, then y is going to go to infinity or negative infinity. As I approach that number from the left, it's also going to go to infinity or negative infinity. Again, b is some sort of definite number. So here, x cannot be 0, and so the vertical asymptote is at x equals 0. That's graph 3. Here, x cannot be negative 3, because that'll make the denominator 0. So that's graph 2. The vertical asymptote is x equals negative 3. Here, x can't be 1, because that'll make the denominator 0. So the vertical asymptote is x equals 1, graph 1. Whenever we're given graphs and word problems, we have to understand what the variables represent. So c of x is the cost per book, and x here must be the total number of books printed, all the books. So x represents the number of books, and c is the cost per book, because we're dividing by the number of books. If I look at this fraction, before I divide by x, that must be all the cost of all the books, period, before I get down to one book. Because if I divide by the number of books, I'll get down to the cost of one book. So this is the total divided by the number. Does that sound familiar? That's the average. If I replace x with 50, I'll get the cost per book for 50 books. If I replace the x by 100, I'll get the cost per book for 100 books. Looks like as the more books I print, the lower cost per book it becomes. We'll change it up a bit here. Now the cost per book is going to be $8. Put the $8 here. And if I want to make a profit, that needs to be larger than the average cost of all the books. I multiply both sides by x. Now that's dangerous because this is an inequality. If x is negative, I have to switch the inequality from greater than to less than. But x represents the number of books. So the number of books is always going to be positive. So I can multiply both sides by x and keep it as greater than. Subtract 4x from both sides, divide both sides by 4. So to be profitable, I have to print more than 30 books. So let's say it's at least 31 books to make a profit. Now they tell us to replace x by a half. And so I get $244 per book. But isn't the half the number of books? What do they mean by half a book? I have no idea. So, as the number of books gets larger and larger and larger, as we take a look at our graph, looks like there's a bottom to this graph. And so it's going to get closer and closer and closer to 4. So as x approaches infinity, as we have more and more books, the cost per book is going to get closer and closer to 4. Now x is a common denominator. So I can replace or put x under each term of the numerator, reduce each one, and I get this expression. It's the same as the original. But now I can see something. This part, as x gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the fraction gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and so it approaches 0 as x gets larger and larger and larger. Well, if this approaches 0, then all I have left is the 4. So if we take a look at these, let x be a common denominator. So this, as x gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that becomes 0, and that's 1. So the horizontal asymptote is -1, and that's this graph. Here in B, the common denominator is x, so I write it out like this. As x gets bigger and bigger and bigger, this becomes 0, and that's 1. So this has a horizontal asymptote of 1, and that's this graph. In C, it's already broken up for us. As x gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that becomes 0, and our horizontal asymptote is -1 again, which is Roman numeral 1. We again in D have to write this with a common denominator. As x gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that becomes 0, and this becomes 4. Our horizontal asymptote is 4, and that's choice 3. In E, it's already broken up for us. As x gets bigger and bigger and bigger, this becomes closer and closer to 0. Our horizontal asymptote is -4 because it approaches -4, and that's, again, choice 2. Again, already broken up for us. That's going to approach 0 because x gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Our horizontal asymptote is 1, and that's choice 4. This one is also broken up for us. As x gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that becomes 0. Our horizontal asymptote is 4, and that's choice 3. Last but not least, we have to break this one up. Common denominator. As x gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that goes to 0, and this is just -4. And that's this choice here. That was Roman numeral 2.